Oh man, the games industry is gonna piss itself now. The UK is taking the loot box issue pretty seriously, as noted by their recent report on the whole issue. So, according to Games Industry here, after nearly 9 months of evidence gathering, the Digital Culture, Media and Sports Committee today published its 84-page report into immersive and addictive technologies. That report can be seen right here in the official UK Parliament website. There are a number of sections on this topic, but the one that I want to take a look at the most is number 3 here, which includes a whole segment dedicated to loot boxes and skin betting and gambling-like behaviors. But before we delve into that, here's the introduction segment, and I'd like to show you one excerpt that kind of sets the tone for this whole report. It reads, "In contrast, we were struck by how difficult it was to get full and clear answers from some of the games and social media companies we spoke to, and were disappointed by the manner in which some representatives engaged with the inquiry. We felt that some representatives demonstrated a lack of honesty and transparency in acknowledging what data is collected, how it is used, and the psychological underpinning of how products are designed, and this made us question what these companies have to hide. It is unacceptable that companies with millions of users, many of them children, should be so ill-equipped to discuss the potential impacts of their products." Let's now dive into the meat of this report. I've highlighted a lot of excerpts in this report, but that's because there's a lot of juicy bits and I feel it's important to spotlight all of them. So let's begin, shall we? Right here at the top it reads, "In the past, the games industry was built on a premium model. People paid up front for a hard copy of a game, and that was the only opportunity for monetization. However, the growth of internet-connected games has enabled the industry to develop new ways of making money, including through microtransactions, small payments that players make throughout the process of playing a game, for example, to acquire in-game skills or items or to progress more quickly through levels." So here's an example that they brought up about RuneScape. It reads, "We were contacted by a member of the public whose adult son built up considerable debts, reported to be in excess of £50,000 through spending on microtransactions in British company Jagex's online game RuneScape. Jagex has no limit on the amount of time or money players can spend on the game. The company's director of player experience, Kelvin Plummer, told us that players can potentially spend up to £1,000 a week or £5,000 a month in RuneScape, but that only one player had hit that limit in the previous 12 months. The company's reasoning for setting this limit seemed to stem from fraud prevention rather than out of duty of care to prevent people spending more than they are able. Jagex does allow players to request deletion of the account or suspension of the account or a payment block. However, crucially in the case of the parent who contacted us for data protection reasons, it can deal only with account holders, and so was unable to take direct action in response to the parents' concerns." Here's another testimonial. One told us that in his 5 years playing RuneScape, "I've spent over 2,000 Canadian dollars on in-game wealth and in-game progression. I'm not proud of this. I've loaded my credit card with 500 Canadian dollars in one night to skip hundreds of hours of content I didn't find enjoyable to unlock achievements because of a promotion they were running. I've spent 300 Canadian dollars in 20 minutes legally on in-game wealth I lost instantly gambling because I wanted more in-game wealth to purchase better gear." Now this right here is important: to skip hundreds of hours of content I didn't find enjoyable to unlock achievements. Welcome to the state of the AAA games landscape. This is exactly how they kind of lure you into spending extra money on these games. They kind of psychologically break you down until you just go, all right, that's it. I'm just going to spend the money. I'm tired of this. This report highlighted how Epic Games, the makers of Fortnite Battle Royale, said that although it has no specific cap on how much people can spend, purchases are limited to what is in the virtual shop, and so the maximum anyone could spend would be about $200 a day. That's a whole lot of bullshit. I'm pretty sure you can spend way more than $200 a day on in-game items in Fortnite, not to mention that you can spend an infinite amount of money on V-Bucks. There's no actual limit on how much currency you can purchase. You can spend $1 million in V-Bucks if you so desire that same day. You can do that. The company's director of marketing suggested that it is an individual's responsibility to manage spending and that the company provides tools, including parental controls, to allow players to make those decisions for themselves. However, as we already examined, parental controls are of limited effectiveness when it comes to adult players. Not to mention that parental controls are so poorly advertised that parents don't really even know that they exist when they buy consoles and such. The report continued, the games companies we spoke to were generally reluctant to accept that they might have a role or responsibility to intervene proactively if a player's spending fell outside of normal patterns. Moreover, they said that it would be too difficult to determine what level of spending might be harmful. Alex Dale, Senior Vice President for King, the makers of Candy Crush Saga, told us that while it used to alert users when they reached a certain spending threshold, it had stopped doing so because of player feedback. He told us we would send an email out when a player's spend was $250 in a week for the first time. It was an email that said, we noticed that you are enjoying the game a lot at that moment. Are you sure you're happy with this? We got back, I wouldn't spend the money if I didn't have it, and things like, I'm fine, please leave me alone. We felt it was too intrusive, so we stopped doing that. So it only took a few people saying, hey, stop sending me emails, to be like, welp, I guess nobody wants us to warn them about their excessive spending. Really, that's the logic? A few people were annoyed, so you absolve yourself of all responsibility in terms of how you design your products, how you monetize your products? That's ridiculous. Now this right here is pretty rich. This segment talks about how the gambling industry is actually more responsible than the games industry. This excerpt reads, Dr. Henrietta Bowden-Jones told us that the games industry might learn from approaches in the gambling industry, which has much clearer industry-wide protocols enabling people to self-exclude from spending. She told us that gaming is several years behind gambling in relation to protecting the vulnerable, a situation that then Minister described, if true, as lamentable, adding that the industry has a job to do. From there, the Royal College of Psychiatrists suggested that there should be no in-game spending by children. Children are less prepared to deal with the potentially addictive nature of some modern computer games and are less able to make informed decisions about spending. There's a reason why credit cards, if you want to have one, you have to be a certain age before you can sign up for one. There's a reason why parents limit the allowance for their children. There should be no situation in which a kid can easily spend thousands of dollars en masse on a single game, which has happened time and again. The BBC published that one article reporting on how kids emptied out their parents' bank account through FIFA Ultimate Team because they wanted to obtain Lionel Messi, so they spend like £500 opening card packs, but they never got Lionel Messi before the parents found out. You can spend £500 compulsively opening packs, trying to get the one thing that you want, but never obtain that item because the game's been designed that way. The report then proceeds by highlighting another testimonial in regards to how video games can encourage gambling-like behaviors. This excerpt reads, many games contain features that are highly similar to conventional gambling products, without gambling being the primary aim of the game. However, there are concerns that being exposed to such features from a young age might normalize gambling. One parent expressed concern that the game Bricky Farm, which is rated suitable for children, contains a gambling-like feature. He told us, most worrying for me is a roulette-style wheel minigame whereby differing amounts of gems can be won for further advancement. This is where the game could become addictive to someone with a susceptibility, but more than that, it is introducing children as young as 4 to the thrill of gambling. The same could be said for titles like NBA 2K20, which was recently bashed for the trailer that labeled itself as PEGI 3 and E for everyone, despite featuring egregious, just blatant gambling, in-your-face gambling, slot machines, drop the ball, roulette, so on and so forth, alongside the card packs, which is gambling, which you can spend real money on. So that means 2K20 has both simulated gambling and real-life gambling, and yet it is still labeled as appropriate for toddlers, which is insane. Legislators seem to agree with this sentiment. Brad Earnwright from the Gambling Commission told us that even when games do not meet the regulatory threshold for gambling, but contain gambling-like features, the regulator does not think the current age ratings are in line with public expectation, so that should not be available for 4+ or even 12+, speaking directly about this bricky farm game. The report then talked about how some believe there isn't enough evidence on the psychological effects of gambling-like mechanics, particularly on children, but that's mainly because, according to them, that they do not have access to the proprietary industry data needed to provide an answer to this question. Scientific research needs to study which gaming mechanisms are the most problematic and needing of both monitoring and regulation. So basically, the games industry doesn't want to disclose a lot of information in regards to how players spend, how they spend their time, and that makes it a lot harder for researchers to actually understand what's going on with loot boxes and how it affects children or adults. From there, the report made the following determination. This is the recommendation that the UK Parliament provided in regards to how to deal with this stuff. This segment reads, "We believe that any gambling-related harms associated with gaming should be recognized under the Online Harms Framework. To inform this work, the Department for Digital, Culture, Media, and Sport should immediately establish a scientific working group to collate the latest evidence relating to the effects of gambling-like mechanics in games. The group should produce an evidence-based review of the effects of gambling-like game mechanics, including loot boxes and other emerging trends, to provide clarity and advice. This should be done within a timescale that enables it to inform the government's forthcoming online harms legislation." They're saying there should be a third-party entity that is looking into this stuff, researching this stuff, as they build towards this legislation that intends to regulate loot boxes. Speaking of loot boxes, that is exactly what the next section is about. It starts with the following statement. "One of the most prominent features in the debate about the potential links between game mechanics and gambling is loot boxes. Loot boxes are items in video games that may be bought for real-world money, but which provide players with a randomized reward of uncertain value. Those rewards will be virtual items for use in the game, such as tools, outfits, and weapons, or characters with particular skills, all of which will be of variable benefit within the game. They are a common form of microtransactions, with a 2018 Gambling Commission survey finding that 31% of 11 to 16-year-olds have paid money or used in-game items to open loot boxes. 31% of these youngsters have engaged in what is pretty much gambling that affect you in the same way that a slot machine would. Now here's an interesting quote from Ben Lewis Evans, a user experience researcher at Epic Games. He said, "The reason these are famous," referring to loot boxes, "is they are quite often the ratios used in gambling. The response they tend to get is very constant and high-level response, and that's because you don't know how many times you have to respond before you get the reward, so people tend to keep at it." The report then really delves into the FIFA series, one of the most notorious when it comes to loot boxes. This whole segment reads as follows, and it's a lot, but trust me, there's a lot of juicy bits here. "Much of the evidence that we received from gamers critiqued the loot box mechanics and Electronic Arts' FIFA series. In the game's Ultimate Team mode, players build their own football team by buying virtual packs containing a randomized selection of footballers. To purchase these packs, players use coins that are earned in the game and points purchased for real-world money. In 2016, EA CFO Blake Jorgensen told investors that the Ultimate Team mode accounted for roughly half of the $1.3 billion the company makes from extra digital content. That is equivalent to $650 million in annual revenue, in addition to that generated by unit sales of the full games. Now, it's important to note that the $650 million figure has grown significantly since then. Pretty sure Ultimate Team can rake in $1 billion every year now." The report continued, "Electronic Arts releases a new game in the FIFA series every year. However, with each new release, players' teams are not transferred over, and therefore they must rebuild their teams by purchasing more packs to acquire the best players. One gamer told us that this cycle resulted in them spending almost £800 to £1,000 a year annually on FIFA. Another gamer told us that because a pack's contents directly affects gameplay because some players are not as good as others, it incentivizes people to keep buying packs in the hope of getting better players and therefore performing better in the game. They told us that in order to compete, players feel like they need to buy hundreds, if not thousands, of pounds worth of packs in order to get the best players. Children are especially vulnerable because they lack the maturity to understand that these purchases are manipulative, and their parents may not understand that these purchases are entirely unnecessary. It's great to see that the egregious annual release model is being highlighted here. One could hardly call the upgrade from FIFA 19 to FIFA 20 or whatever justified. It's just like this quarter step up. It feels like FIFA 20 is just a patch of FIFA 19 rather than a full-fledged new game with significant additions. The reason this annual model exists is to wipe the slate clean every year so that players have to start from nothing and spend money on gambling yet again in order to earn the best players yet again. It is a part of this vicious cycle of monetization. The report then delved deeper into FIFA by stating, moreover, because the probability of securing some footballers in a pack is less than 1%, whatever that may be, 1 in 1,000, 1 in a million, who knows. Some gamers have expressed frustration at spending vast amounts without receiving the desired reward. To tackle the issue of speculative spending on loot boxes, one player recommended that the sale of items in-game, cosmetic or otherwise, should only be allowed via direct purchase or via achievements unlocked through in-game actions. In a loot box type system, the player typically has a very small chance of unlocking the item they actually want. This encourages further spending on loot boxes in order to get the item they want. We put some of these concerns to Kerry Hopkins from Electronic Arts. Kerry Hopkins, for those who don't know, is the infamous EA executive who touted how loot boxes are not loot boxes, but in fact, surprise mechanics. And on Kerry Hopkins, the report said, who responded that the way they have implemented this mechanic in FIFA is quite ethical and quite fun. Yet this is noticeably out of step with the attitude of many of the gamers who contacted us following our evidence session, including those who vehemently rejected her characterization of packs not as loot boxes but as surprise mechanics. One gamer called the company's testimony to us a barefaced lie, and another told us that the company has heavily marketed and referred to their systems as loot boxes for several years, and the mechanics of the system are exactly the same no matter what they choose to call it. Indeed, that is exactly correct. EA is more than happy to use the term loot boxes when it garners positive reception, when they tweet out stuff like, oh, this game won't have loot boxes, as they did with Anthem and Battlefield. But as soon as they implement loot boxes, as soon as they foresee backlash, they'll say, no, this is fun, this is ethical, this is surprise mechanics, this is not gambling. They think we're morons, essentially. They'll introduce a system that acts and behaves just like loot boxes and think that not calling them loot boxes will somehow trick us, that this is all it takes to pull one over our heads. In response to all of this, the report said that the UK Parliament recommends that loot boxes that contain the element of chance should not be sold to children playing games, and instead, in-game credits should be earned through rewards won through playing the games. You mean like how it used to work back in the day? Sure, that'd be nice if we could actually go back to that era. In the absence of research which proves that no harm is being done by exposing children to gambling through the purchasing of loot boxes, then we believe the precautionary principle should apply, and they are not permitted in games played by children until the evidence proves otherwise. Couldn't agree more. Next segment is titled Potential Harms of Loot Boxes, and it starts with Dr. Aaron Drummond and Dr. James Sauer telling Parliament in written evidence that the random delivery of loot box rewards is akin to conventional gambling products and designed to exploit potent psychological mechanisms associated with the development and maintenance of gambling-like behaviors. So loot boxes are pretty much just like gambling. This excerpt further highlighted a link between loot boxes and gambling. Quote, a study by Dr. David Zendel and Dr. Paul Cairns identified a link between the amount that gamers spend on loot boxes and their score on the Problem Gambling Severity Index. Moreover, the large-scale study of more than 7,000 gamers suggested that the gambling-like features of loot boxes are specifically responsible for the observed relationship between problem gambling and spending on loot boxes, as other forms of microtransactions did not display such a strong link. A further study found the same link among adolescents. In fact, the link between loot box spending and problem gambling among adolescents was more than twice as strong as the relationship observed in adults. That is, of course, because for minors, for adolescents, their minds are less developed, their minds are more malleable, So they are more bound to become addicted to gambling if they're exposed to that mechanic. Dr. Zendo did add that loot boxes may not be necessarily a gateway to problem gambling, but rather that video game companies may accidentally or incidentally be profiting from problem gambling among their consumers. Let's not kid ourselves, this is no accident. Game companies know when they see data on, how one player spends a ridiculous amount of money, they know that there might be something there, that this might be somebody spending compulsively, but they're more than happy to profit from that individual. They're more than happy to sit back and not do anything about that. The report then noted that Dr. Zendel and Dr. Cairns, among others, therefore make the case for enhanced regulation of loot boxes, such as ensuring games containing loot boxes carry parental advisories or descriptors outlining that they feature gambling content, and propose that serious consideration is given to restricting games with loot boxes to players of legal gambling age. Brad Enright told us that these seemed like very sensible recommendations, which the video game industry should probably take stock of. You mean applying the regulations stipulated by PEGI and the ESRB? I mean, the ESRB's website says that simulated gambling gets a teen rating and that real gambling gets an adults-only rating. But because the ESRB is lobbied, because it's run by the games industry, the people who would stand to benefit by not having loot boxes regulated, they'll claim that loot boxes aren't gambling, therefore it doesn't fit the definition of gambling, and that's how they kind of circumvent the whole issue. That's how they avoid their own policies. The report then talked about the PEGI system specifically, stating that, quote, games regulated under the PEGI system can feature content labels alerting users to the fact they contain in-game purchases. However, there is no specific content descriptor for loot boxes, despite Dr. Zendel telling us that they are formally very different to other microtransactions. Moreover, PEGI has a content label alerting users to the fact a game contains actual or simulated gambling. However, again, this does not apply to games with loot boxes. The reason for this has been stated by a PEGI representative who said the main reason for this is that we cannot define what constitutes gambling. That is the responsibility of a national gambling commission. If a gambling commission would state that loot boxes are a form of gambling, then we would have to adjust our criteria to that. Yet, Dr. Mark Griffiths argues that PEGI's position appears to be somewhat hardline, given that PEGI's descriptor of gambling content is used whenever any video game teaches or encourages gambling. Such a descriptor would arguably cover gambling-like games or activities, and the buying of loot boxes is gambling-like at the very least. So again, just look at how NBA 2K20 is rated PEGI 3, whereas Pokemon Red is rated PEGI 12. Pokemon Red actually is scrutinized properly. NBA 2K20 gets a pass for some reason, despite gambling being tied much more heavily to the game's core systems. Doesn't make any sense, does it? In response to all of this, the report recommended the following. Loot box mechanics are integral to major games companies' revenues, and evidence that they facilitate profiting from problem gamblers should be of serious concern to the industry. We recommend that working through the PEGI Council and all other relevant channels, the UK government advises PEGI to apply the existing gambling content labeling and corresponding age limits to games containing loot boxes that can be purchased for real-world money and do not reveal their contents before purchase. Essentially, they're saying start treating loot boxes like they're gambling, because they are. The report then delves into the legal definition of gambling and how in order for gambling to be defined as gambling under the law, there has to be something that's money's worth. It has to involve a real cashing out. On that front, here's what the report had to say. The existing legislative framework has been critiqued by Dr. Aaron Drummond and Dr. James Sauer, who argue that real-world monetary value is too narrow a definition of value when it comes to loot boxes. It ignores the subjective value created for players from the combination of scarcity of and competitive advantage provided by in-game items in the gaming environment. These in-game rewards can have value for players and influence players' behavior, i.e. motivate them to engage with loot box mechanisms without being converted into real currency. Perhaps more importantly, it ignores the fact that players are demonstrably willing to pay real money for the chance to acquire these items, implying they have a monetary value even in the absence of the ability to convert them back into currency. Basically, just because you can't cash out doesn't mean that players don't place some kind of value, whether it's emotional or monetary in their own terms, on these items. Not being able to cash out is not an excuse to not label loot boxes as gambling, because in the end, there's clear evidence that people do place a lot of value in these in-game items, given how much they're willing to spend on them. The discussion then shifted towards the fact that some games do in fact allow you to cash out, and Kerry Hopkins from EA said that, quote, "There is a 24/7 security staff monitoring activity to be sure that people are not engaging in this type of behavior." But on that front, the report from the UK Parliament said the prevalence of real-world trading suggests the industry does not have as secure a hold on it as it might argue. And Dr. Mark Griffiths told us that the Gambling Commission's position appears to be a case of the law struggling to keep pace with technology. Indeed, the Gambling Commission's written evidence states that the problem is more widespread than the industry acknowledges. Based on open source research, the volume, variety, and sophistication of websites' advertising opportunities to exchange in-game items for cash indicates that to term such circumvention of regulation as occasional understates the extent of this issue for certain games. We are concerned that there are large video game companies who are failing to proactively enforce their own platform's terms of use to prevent in-game items being readily exchanged for cash. Whilst technical challenges may exist, such companies should have the resource and creative talent to develop solutions, and we consider they have a responsibility given these problems have arisen from the platform and ecosystem for games that they have created in pursuit of commercial objectives. So EA and other companies like EA try to absolve themselves of the fact that there are third-party gambling sites that they don't officially sanction, but they never acknowledge the fact that they themselves established a platform that allows for these third-party gambling sites to exist. And then among the examples brought up on this front is Counter-Strike Global Offensive, which allows players to cash out valuable skins for thousands of dollars. Moving on, the report talked about how Belgium has declared that loot boxes are in fact gambling because they have a broader definition of the term prize. The report then talked about what would happen if legislation were to be enacted across the UK and other regions. The report said if legislation was changed, any games company using loot boxes would need to obtain an operating license, which are accompanied by a range of regulations around transparency, duty of care, and age restrictions. Yet, the way in which games companies have withdrawn mechanics in response to the ruling in Belgium suggests that, in reality, it would withdraw all the mechanics. It presumably would not want to be subject to all the rules and regulations. So what this segment is trying to say is that Belgium didn't outright ban loot boxes. They simply told companies like EA, hey, remove your loot boxes until you apply for the proper license, until you go through the proper channels that are related to our gambling regulations. And these companies, instead of doing that, they just said, nah, we're pulling out, because they don't want to be subject to all the rules and regulations. They prefer to not include loot boxes over actually having to follow gambling rules. This is why it is believed that if gambling regulations were to be applied to loot boxes across the board, loot boxes would just disappear from gaming, because companies would just not want to deal with all the regulations. They wouldn't want to go through the proper channels. These companies would just withdraw from loot boxes altogether instead of implementing them and having the government or, whatever regulatory entity poking and prodding in what they're doing. The discussion then shifted to video games having to disclose loot box odds. China stipulates this, and the ESA recently made a commitment to have all major platforms and all major publishers disclose the odds of loot boxes. But according to this report, if loot boxes were still legally defined as gambling, that is not a substitute for a gambling license or all the conditions they impose. Disclosing odds is not enough to circumvent gambling laws. Like, that by itself is not an adequate solution. Disclosing odds doesn't prevent people from actually engaging in gambling or loot boxes. Hell, gambling, actual gambling, casinos and such do disclose odds, and people still sometimes can get obsessed with that stuff. Not to mention that children and kids and adolescents and underage people in particular may not to the full extent understand what these odds entail. They may not understand how bad these odds are. A 10-year-old is not going to look at less than 1% and do the math and see, oh, wow, the odds are really bad here. I better not play FIFA. They're not going to care about that stuff. They're just going to want Lionel Messi or whatever valuable player the game shoves in their faces. There's a whole segment on skin gambling, and there's talk of how 3% of 11 to 16-year-olds had bet with in-game items on websites outside of video games or privately. 3% might be a small percentage, but it's still too many. These are 11 to 16-year-olds engaging in these shady websites where skin economy is prominent, where skin gambling is prominent. They are literally doing gambling. And the ones enabling that are the video games that act as the foundation for these third-party websites. On that front, the Gambling Commission argues that the games industry has a role to play in preventing such third-party activities. Its written evidence states the significant risk of harm posed by these unregulated gambling websites, whilst unintended, is nonetheless a byproduct of the manner in which games have been developed and in-game economies incorporated for commercial benefit. Despite there being no evidence of any direct commercial relationship between games publishers and the illegal gambling facilities, it is reasonable to infer that there is an indirect benefit derived from these activities, given they drive engagement with the game, and it is the game publishers who are the ultimate source of in-game items, acting as a de facto central bank. Couldn't have put that better myself. And then this segment concludes with this declaration: we consider loot boxes that can be bought with real money and do not reveal their contents in advance to be games of chance played for money's worth. They're gambling. The government should bring forward regulations under Section 6 of the Gambling Act 2005 in the next parliamentary session to specify that loot boxes are a game of chance. If it determines not to regulate loot boxes under the act at this time, the government should produce a paper clearly stating the reasons why it does not consider loot boxes paid for with real-world currency to be a game of chance played for money's worth. So things are moving along, folks. Assuming that the government sees eye to eye with this report, regulation could be just around the corner. And one major country enacting regulation on this front is all it takes for other government bodies around the world to kind of take notice of this and maybe do something about this issue as well. It just takes one push of that snowball for it to roll and roll until it becomes unstoppable. Now, as you'd expect, the games industry has responded. Here's what Dr. Joe Twist, the chief executive of UK Interactive Entertainment, said. The video games industry has always and will continue to put the welfare of players at the heart of what we do. Bullshit. The industry does not dispute that for a minority, finding balance is a problem. Well, guess what? Alcoholism is a problem for the minority, but it's enough of a problem that there are proper systems in place. So don't give me that minority bullshit. The minority is who we need to look out for. This is why we are vocal in supporting efforts to increase digital literacy and work with schools and carers on education programs. Or how about you don't do the shady stuff you guys are doing so that people don't have to worry about being preyed upon by games companies? How about that? What a novel idea. And then the ESA said that they strongly disagree with the UK government's report on loot boxes. It said, we take seriously, no you don't, the issue raised in the UK Parliament's Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee report, but strongly disagree with its findings. You disagree with research, evidence, testimonials? Really? You disagree? That's all you're going to say? I don't like what you're saying here. We disagree. That's the best you got? Present evidence that counters this 84-page report. The fact that you have shown nothing tangible says that you have no argument to make. As demonstrated by the recent announcement of policies regarding the disclosure of the relative rarity or probability of obtaining virtual items in paid loot boxes, as well as the robust parental controls that empower parents to control in-game purchases, the video game industry is a leader in partnering with parents and players to create enjoyable video game experiences. Who is going to buy this bullshit? Honestly, they have the audacity to say they're a leader in partnering with parents and players? Oh my god. Yeah. NBA 2K20, what a great example of being leaders in partnering with parents and players. In addition, numerous regulatory bodies around the world, including those in Australia, France, Ireland, Germany, and the UK, have come to a conclusion starkly different than that of this committee. No. They've said that according to current gambling laws, loot boxes cannot be deemed as gambling officially on these countries yet. But that doesn't mean these countries aren't concerned about the effects of loot boxes. That doesn't mean they aren't concerned about possibly having to update their laws in order to compensate for the fact that loot boxes are so prevalent now. Robust parental tools that empower parents. If a game is meant for kids, a parent shouldn't have to go in there and determine whether they have to set certain limits. A game for kids should just be something players can buy for their kids and then not have to worry. That's what a game for kids is. That's what you're saying when you label a game E for everyone or PEGI 3. That parental controls have no part to play, that they're not required, that parents don't have to worry. And yet your argument is, well, they're parental controls. The fact that parental controls have to exist for games rated for kids says everything. Alright, I think this video has gone on for long enough. I'll let you guys go. But, yeah. The games industry continues to make desperate arguments and defenses and justifications that anyone with common sense will scoff at, whilst the UK Parliament continues to look into this and scrutinize the games industry, continues to do research, reaching out to people who have experienced the harms of loot boxes and presenting all that information pretty neatly across this report. This speaks for itself. I think it's well constructed, and I hope they continue to do more research and gather more evidence that the games industry will not be able to squirm their way out of. So that's it, folks. That's all I have to say on the UK Parliament's report and the games industry's pathetic response to all of this. Let me know in the comments below what your take is on this situation, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.